Get your ass out of that chair, old man, the lance corporal sneered. The chow hall fell dead silent. Elias didn't look up, knuckles white as the Marine grabbed his faded red jacket. This table is for warriors, not washed-up civilians. Elias touched the dented P-38 can opener hidden against his chest. Suddenly, the fluorescent lights faded, replaced by the scream of mortars and the taste of blood. The arrogant boy didn't know he was assaulting the legend who saved the 2nd Battalion at the Citadel. He didn't know he was waking up Iron Haze. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. The rain at Camp Lejeune didn't wash things clean. It just made everything heavier. Outside Mess Hall 404, the sky was a bruised purple, dumping a torrent of water that turned the manicured lawns into swamps. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, industrial-strength floor wax, and the lingering grease of 1,000 Hamburger Tuesdays. Elias Thorne sat alone at a table near the back, far away from the noisy serving lines. He preferred the corner. It was the only spot in the cavernous room where he could put his back against a solid wall. A habit picked up 50 years ago that no amount of peacetime could erase. He adjusted his seat, wincing as a sharp bolt of lightning shot up his right hip. The damp weather always woke the shrapnel up. It gnawed at the bone like a rat. Elias pulled his vintage red leather jacket tighter around himself. The jacket was older than most of the men in this room, the leather cracked and softened by decades of wear, a faded shade of crimson that stood out like a sore thumb in the sea of digital camouflage. Underneath, he wore his gray janitorial work shirt, but on his lunch break he always wore the jacket. It was his armor against the chill of the air conditioning. He picked up his fork, his hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the Parkinson's that had begun to steal his dexterity. He just wanted to eat his potatoes in peace before his shift started again at 1300 hours. He just wanted a moment of silence. "Hey, are you deaf?" The voice was loud, arrogant, and far too close. Elias paused, a forkful of potatoes hovering halfway to his mouth. He didn't turn. He knew that tone. He had heard it in boot camp in '66, he had heard it in the officers' clubs in the '80s, and he heard it now. It was the sound of a man who thought rank was the same thing as respect. "I said move," the voice demanded. Elias slowly lowered his fork. He turned his head. Looming over him was a mountain of a kid, a lance corporal. Judging by the insignia on his collar, he couldn't have been more than 20 years old. His head was shaved high and tight, his jaw set in a practiced scowl of intimidation. Behind him stood 3 other Marines, looking uncomfortable, their trays heavy with food, shifting their weight from foot to foot. "This is an 8-top table," the lance corporal, whose name tape read Miller, spat out, gesturing grandly to the empty seats around Elias. "And you're one wrinkled old civilian taking up the whole damn view. We want the window." Elias looked at the window. It was streaked with gray rain. There was nothing to see but a dumpster and a wet parking lot. "There are plenty of other tables, son," Elias said, his voice raspy, like dry leaves tumbling over gravel. Miller's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his tray down on the table, the plastic clattering violently against the metal surface. A cup of juice toppled over, sending a stream of orange liquid racing toward Elias's elbow. "Don't you son me," Miller hissed, leaning in. "I am a United States Marine. You are a guest on my base, a guest who is stealing space from active duty personnel who actually work for a living." The irony tasted bitter in Elias's mouth. He had mopped these floors at 400 hours this morning. He had cleaned the latrines these boys destroyed last night. He had polished the brass plaque in the foyer that listed the names of the fallen, names he knew personally. "And I'm just finishing my meal," Elias said softly, dabbing at the spilled juice with a napkin. "I'll be gone in 5 minutes." "I don't have 5 minutes," Miller shouted. The mess hall had gone quiet. The low hum of conversation died out, replaced by the tension of a drawn bowstring. Heads turned, dozens of eyes fixed on the scene, the aggressive young buck towering over the old man in the red jacket. "You know what this is." Miller pointed a finger at his own chest, tapping his camouflage uniform hard. "This is service. This is glory. We are training to defend your freedom, old man. The least you can do is show some gratitude and get out of the way." Elias looked into Miller's eyes. He saw no wisdom there, only insecurity masquerading as strength. He saw a boy who had never been shot at, who had never held a dying friend in the mud, who thought war was a movie where the good guys always won and the uniforms always stayed clean. "You have no idea what service costs," Elias whispered. That broke the dam. Miller snapped. He reached out, his thick fingers grabbing the collar of Elias's red leather jacket. He bunched the material in his fist, jerking the old man forward. The sudden motion sent a shockwave of pain through Elias's bad hip, stealing his breath. "You listen to me, you senile old—" Miller screamed, his face inches from Elias's, spittle flying. "I will throw you out into the rain myself." The other soldiers in the background gasped. In the distance, a tray dropped with a loud clang, but Elias didn't hear them. As Miller pulled him forward, the collar of his shirt shifted. Elias's hand flew to his chest, a defensive reflex, but he didn't strike back. Instead, his fingers curled around the chain hanging around his neck. His thumb found it. It wasn't a crucifix. It wasn't a medallion. It was a P-38 can opener. A tiny, rusted piece of stamped steel, no bigger than a matchbook, hanging next to two dog tags that had been worn smooth by time. The metal was cold against his thumb. The sensation was an electric shock that bypassed his brain and went straight to his nervous system. The smell of the mess hall, the bleach, the meatloaf, the floor wax, vanished instantly. The air suddenly smelled of burning diesel and wet rot. The temperature in the room plummeted. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, replaced by the strobe light flashes of muzzle fire. Miller's screaming face blurred, twisting and morphing until it wasn't a lance corporal anymore. It was the face of a terrified radio man screaming for a medic. Elias wasn't in North Carolina. He wasn't 76 years old. He wasn't a janitor. The totem had done its work. He was back. He was 24 years old. He was in the Citadel, and the enemy was coming through the walls. Escritor de Historias Emocionantes, Custom Gem, Chapter 2. The War Movie. The transition wasn't a fade, it was a collision. 1 second, Elias was breathing the recycled air of a mess hall in North Carolina. The next, his lungs were burning with the thick, wet heat of Southeast Asia. The fluorescent lights were gone, replaced by a sky the color of a hematoma, low and heavy, threatening to crush the world beneath it. Hugh City, February 1968. The Citadel. The rain here didn't fall. It was driven sideways by a wind that screamed like a banshee. It turned the dust of centuries-old stone walls into a gray slurry that coated everything. Skin, rifles, teeth. It tasted of lime and sulfur. Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne, known to the 2nd Battalion as Iron Haze, crouched behind the shattered remains of a marble altar. He wasn't the fragile old man in the red leather jacket anymore. He was 24 years old, carved out of teak wood and sleeplessness, his eyes scanning the gloom through the aperture of a crumbled wall. "Sergeant, I can't feel my toes," a voice whispered from the darkness to his left. Elias didn't turn. He knew who it was. Private First Class Robert Sterling. The kid was 19, a radio man from Ohio, with a grin that usually split his face ear to ear. Right now, there was no grin, just the wide, white eyes of a boy who had realized that glory was a lie told by recruiters. "Check your weapons, Sterling," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the sound of the monsoon. "Your toes don't matter. Your rifle does." "They're coming, aren't they?" Sterling asked, his voice cracking. He hugged the PRC-25 radio against his chest like a teddy bear. "Yeah," Elias said, checking the magazine in his M16. "They're coming." They were holed up in the ruins of a Catholic church on the edge of the NVA-held sector. The roof was gone, blown away by artillery, leaving the interior exposed to the deluge. The pews were splintered kindling. The statues of saints were headless, their stone hands raised in futile prayer against the incoming mortar fire. There were 6 of them left, 6 Marines cut off from the main force, surrounded by an entire regiment of North Vietnamese regulars. The silence that preceded the attack was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. In the distance, the thump-thump of a .50 caliber heavy machine gun echoed off the stone walls, rhythmic and dull, like the heartbeat of a dying giant. "Check in," Elias ordered, his voice flat. "Dutch, green," came a grunt from the pile of rubble near the heavy oak doors. Dutch was the machine gunner, a massive corn-fed boy cradling an M60 like it was a toy. Miller, green. Ski, green. They were tired. They hadn't slept in 3 days. Their fatigues were rotting off their bodies, the jungle rot eating at their skin. But they were Marines. "Sterling," Elias said, looking at the kid. "Get on the horn. Tell command we need that extraction. Tell them we can't hold the church past sundown." Sterling nodded, his hands shaking as he lifted the handset. "Dragon 6, this is Iron 19. Over. Static, just the hiss of the rain. Dragon 6, this is Iron 19, do you copy? Over." "Nothing." "Our batteries are wet, Sarge," Sterling whispered, panic creeping into his throat. I can't get through." Elias crawled over, the mud sucking at his knees. He grabbed the handset, checking the connections. "Keep trying. Don't stop until you hear a voice." Suddenly, the world exploded. A B-40 rocket slammed into the exterior wall of the church, blowing a hole the size of a truck through the stone. The concussion knocked the wind out of Elias, slamming him face first into the mud. Dust and debris rained down, choking him. "Here they come!" Dutch screamed from the door. The M60 roared to life, a chainsaw sound that ripped through the air. Chug, 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 chug. Elias scrambled to his feet, wiping mud from his eyes. Through the hole in the wall, he saw them. Shadows moving in the rain. Dozens of them. NVA soldiers in pith helmets and khaki uniforms, swarming over the rubble like army ants. "Contact front," Elias yelled, bringing his rifle up. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil dug into his shoulder, a familiar, comforting kick. He saw a shadow drop, then another. The church erupted into chaos. Green tracers from the enemy AK-47s zipped through the air like angry hornets, snapping against the stone pillars. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of screams, explosions, and the relentless rattle of automatic fire. "They're flanking left," Ski shouted, before a burst of gunfire cut him off. He crumpled behind a pew, clutching his shoulder. "Suppressive fire!" Elias roared, moving toward the breach. He fired in controlled bursts, dropping 2 men who were trying to climb through the rubble. "Dutch, keep them off the wall!" "I'm trying, Sarge," Dutch yelled back. The M60 was singing, spitting hot brass casings onto the wet floor. It was the only thing keeping the enemy at bay. As long as that gun was talking, they had a chance. And then, the worst sound in the world happened. Click. The M60 went silent. "Jam!" Dutch screamed, frantically pulling at the charging handle. "I got a jam!" The enemy sensed the silence immediately. The volume of incoming fire doubled. They knew the dragon was asleep. "Fix it!" Elias yelled, firing his last magazine toward the breach. "It's a ruptured case!" Dutch panicked, his big fingers slipping on the wet metal. "It's stuck in the chamber. I can't get a grip on it." They had seconds, maybe less. The NVA were already cresting the wall, bayonets fixed. Elias didn't think. He moved. He sprinted across the open nave, bullets kicking up geysers of mud around his boots. He slid into the position beside Dutch, the heat radiating off the jammed machine gun. "Move!" Elias barked, shoving the big man aside. He looked at the breach. The casing was sheared off, wedged deep in the hot chamber. Fingers were useless. A knife was too big. They were going to die. Right here. In a ruined church in a city nobody back home could pronounce. Elias's hand flew to his neck. He yanked the chain so hard it snapped against his skin. He didn't fumble. He didn't look. He knew exactly what was there. The P-38. The tiny stamped piece of government steel. The John Wayne. He jammed the small, hooked blade of the can opener into the chamber, catching the rim of the ruptured casing. The metal sizzled against his thumb, burning the skin, but he didn't feel it. He twisted. The casing popped out. "Feed!" Elias screamed. Dutch slammed the feed tray cover down and racked the bolt. Chug, 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 chug. The M60 roared back to life. Point blank. The wave of NVA soldiers at the wall disintegrated under the hail of 7.62mm rounds. The assault broke. The enemy faltered, retreating back into the rain. Elias slumped against the sandbags, his chest heaving. He looked at the P-38 in his hand. It was black with carbon and hot to the touch. He closed his fist around it, the metal biting into his palm. "We have to move," Elias gasped, coughing up gray dust. "They'll mortar us next. We have to get to the extraction point." "Sarge," Sterling called out from the radio corner. "I got them. Choppers are inbound. LZ Bravo. 3 clicks south." "3 clicks through hell," Elias muttered. He stood up, his legs shaking. "All right, Marines. On your feet. We are leaving this hotel." They moved out into the rain, a ragged column of ghosts. The run to the LZ was a blur of violence. They moved through narrow alleys, fighting house to house. The rain never let up. The mud was knee-deep, sucking at their boots, trying to hold them down. They were 200 yards from the landing zone, a muddy soccer field near the Perfume River, when the ambush hit. It came from the rooftops. A crossfire. "Ambush!" Elias yelled, diving behind a low stone wall. Bullets chewed up the ground where they had just been standing. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" It was Sterling. The kid was thrashing in the middle of the street, clutching his leg. The water around him turned red instantly. "Sterling!" Elias screamed. "Leave him!" Dutch yelled, firing wildly at the rooftops. "Sarge, we gotta go! The birds are coming!" The sound of rotors thumping the air filled the sky. The Hueys were coming in fast, skimming the treetops. Elias looked at the choppers. He looked at the safety of the open field. Then he looked at Sterling, lying alone in the kill zone, his face pale, his hand reaching out. "My boy," Sterling was mumbling, staring at the sky. "Marcus, tell him." Elias didn't hesitate. "Cover me," he ordered. "Sarge, no." Elias broke cover. He ran back into the street, directly into the teeth of the enemy fire. He could hear the bullets snapping past his ears like angry insects. Crack, crack, zip. He slid into the mud beside Sterling. The kid's leg was a mess, bone visible. He was going into shock. "I got you, kid," Elias grunted, grabbing Sterling by the webbing of his flak jacket. "I got you." "Sarge, go," Sterling whispered. "Shut up," Elias growled. "Nobody walks alone, not in my squad." He hoisted the boy up, throwing Sterling's arm over his shoulder. The weight was immense. Elias's boots slipped in the bloody mud. He took a step, then another. Thwack. It felt like someone had swung a sledgehammer into his right hip. The impact spun Elias around. He didn't feel the pain at first, just the sudden loss of gravity. He hit the ground hard, Sterling collapsing on top of him. Elias looked down. His right hip was gone. Just a mass of red ruin where his leg met his torso. Shrapnel from a mortar round, or a heavy caliber slug. It didn't matter. He couldn't stand. "Sarge!" Dutch was there, grabbing Sterling. "Take him!" Elias screamed, the pain finally hitting him like a tidal wave. It was white-hot, blinding. "Take him to the bird." "I ain't leaving you," Dutch roared, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I can't walk, you dumb son of a bitch." Elias shoved Dutch away. "Get him on that chopper. That is a direct order." Dutch looked at Elias, then at the wounded Sterling. He made the only choice he could. He hoisted Sterling onto his shoulder. "Yeah, go." Elias fired his M16 from the prone position, spraying the rooftops to suppress the enemy. "Go!" Dutch ran. He made it to the Huey. The door gunners were laying down a wall of fire. Elias watched them load Sterling on board. He saw the kid reach out a hand toward him as the chopper lifted off, the rotor wash blasting mud into Elias's face. The bird rose, banking hard to the east. Elias was alone. The enemy was closing in, He could hear their voices. He could hear the splash of their boots in the water. He checked his ammo. Empty. He reached for his sidearm. Gone. Lost in the mud. He lay back, the rain washing the blood from his face. He felt strangely calm. The pain in his hip was dulling into a cold numbness. His hand moved to his chest. He found the chain. He found the P-38. He gripped it tight. "Come on, then," he whispered to the gray sky. "Come and get it." The darkness at the edge of his vision began to creep in. The sounds of the NVA shouting faded. The rain sounded like applause. He closed his eyes, holding the can opener like a holy relic. He thought of home. He thought of the silence. And then, everything went black. The mess hall in Camp Lejeune came back into focus with the violence of a car crash. The smell of cordite vanished, replaced instantly by the smell of meatloaf. The roar of the helicopter was replaced by the hum of the refrigerator units. Elias blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't in the mud. He was in a chair. His hand was still clutching the P-38 beneath his shirt, and Lance Corporal Miller was still standing there, his fist bunched in Elias's jacket, oblivious to the fact that he was holding a man who had just returned from hell. The memory had lasted 3 seconds in real time, but in Elias's eyes, 1,000 years had just passed. He looked up at Miller. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. Elias Thorne didn't see a lance corporal. He saw a child playing dress-up. "Take your hand," Elias said, his voice no longer raspy but cold and hard as the steel against his chest. "Off my jacket." Lance Corporal Miller stared at the old man, his brain struggling to process the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The trembling, submissive janitor was gone. In his place sat a man whose eyes were cold, dead things, like shark eyes rolling back right before a strike. "You threatening me, old man?" Miller laughed, though it sounded nervous, brittle. He tightened his grip on the red leather collar, his knuckles turning white. "I could snap you in half like a twig. Now get up, or I'm going to—" "Attention on deck!" The command roared from the front of the mess hall, loud enough to rattle the silverware. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a thunderclap. The effect was instantaneous. Every Marine in the room dropped what they were holding. Forks clattered to trays. Conversations died in throats. Chairs scraped violently against the linoleum as 200 bodies scrambled to the position of attention. Miller froze. The color drained from his face. He released Elias's jacket as if it had suddenly turned into a burning coal and snapped his heels together. His eyes locked on the wall ahead of him, his posture rigid. Elias didn't stand. He couldn't. His hip was throbbing with a dull, sickening heat, and his hands were shaking again, the adrenaline of the flashback fading into the tremors of age. He stayed seated, slumped slightly in his chair, clutching the P-38 in his hand like a lifeline. The double doors at the entrance were held open by 2 military police officers, their faces hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. Between them walked a man who seemed to absorb the light in the room. He was tall, with graying hair cut aggressively short and a face carved from granite. He moved with a predator's grace, despite the slight limp that mirrored Elias's own. On his collar, 3 silver stars gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Lieutenant General Marcus Sterling, Corps Commander. The silence in the mess hall was absolute. You could hear the hum of the vending machines. You could hear the rain tapping against the glass. General Sterling didn't walk. He patrolled. His eyes swept the room, taking in the spilled food, the terrified faces of the privates, and finally, the disturbance in the back corner. He began to walk down the center aisle, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Click, click, click. He was flanked by his sergeant major and a small entourage of officers, but nobody looked at them. All eyes were on the general. Miller was sweating. A bead of perspiration rolled down his temple, tracing the line of his jaw. He was vibrating with terror. He knew what this looked like, a disturbance in the chow hall. But he also knew he was active duty, a warrior, and the man sitting down was just a civilian janitor. He convinced himself, in that split second, that the general would understand. Sterling stopped at the table. He stood 6 feet away, his presence looming like a storm front. "Report," the general said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a collapsing building. Miller swallowed hard. He kept his eyes forward, screaming the words. "Sir, Lance Corporal Miller, sir, I was attempting to clear a table for squad use, sir. This civilian refused to vacate the area designated for personnel, sir." Miller risked a glance downward at Elias, a sneer flickering on his lips. "I was escorting him out to maintain order, sir." The general didn't look at Miller. He didn't even acknowledge the Lance Corporal's existence. His eyes were fixed on the table. He looked at the spilled juice. He looked at the cracked red leather jacket. And then, his gaze locked onto the object in Elias's trembling hand. The P-38 can opener. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, leaning in. The room held its breath, at ease. Sterling whispered. But he wasn't talking to Miller. Miller blinked, confused, but he relaxed his stance slightly. The general ignored him. He walked around the table, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of Elias. He looked down at the old janitor, studying the lines in his face, the gray stubble, the way his hand shook. "That's a P-38, Sterling said softly. It wasn't a question. Elias looked up. His eyes were watery, the cataracts clouding the blue, but he saw the general clearly. He saw the name tape, Sterling. The air left Elias's lungs. "Oh, best piece of kit the Army ever made," Elias rasped, his voice barely audible. "Opens cans, cleans boots, fixes jams." The general went rigid. The muscle in his jaw jumped. "Fixes jams," Sterling repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the red jacket again. He looked at the scar running down the side of Elias's neck, a faint white line left by a piece of shrapnel 50 years ago. "My father," the general started, his voice cracking, losing its command polish, sounding suddenly like a son. "My father told me about a man who fixed a jam with a P-38, in a church, in Hugh City." Elias stared at the general. In the younger man's face, he saw the ghost of the radio man. He saw the same wide jaw, the same stubborn brow. "Robert," Elias whispered. His name was Robert. A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. Miller's mouth fell open. The general's eyes filled with tears. He dropped his cane, a polished black stick he carried for ceremony, and it clattered loudly to the floor. He didn't care. "He told me," Sterling said, his voice trembling, "that he screamed for you to leave him. He told me you came back into the street. He told me you carried him when you couldn't even walk. He was my radio man," Elias said simply, shrugging one shoulder as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You don't leave your radio man." "He came home," Sterling said, tears now spilling onto his cheeks. "He came home, and he married my mother. He raised me. He died 4 years ago, in his bed, surrounded by his grandchildren." The general took a breath that shuddered through his chest. He looked at the old man in the janitor's uniform, the man who had been shoved, humiliated, and treated like trash by the very soldiers he had saved. "He told me the man who saved him was named Elias Thorne, callsign Iron Haze. We thought you died in the Citadel, Elias." The report said, "Missing in action, presumed killed." "I'm hard to kill," Elias muttered, a faint, crooked smile touching his lips. The general straightened up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, regaining his composure. He turned slowly to look at Lance Corporal Miller. Miller was trembling violently now. He looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. "You," Sterling said. The word was a bullet. "Sir, I didn't know," Miller stammered, his voice high and thin. "You didn't know," Sterling repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You see a man in a red jacket and you see trash. I see a man who walked through fire so you could be born. I see a man who carries more honor in his broken fingernail than you will ever have in your entire life." The general turned back to Elias. The entire mess hall was watching. 200 Marines, silent as the grave, slowly, deliberately, General Marcus Sterling, commander of the Corps, snapped his heels together. He raised his right hand, fingers stiff, brim of his hand perfectly aligned with his eyebrow. He rendered a slow, agonizingly respectful hand salute. It held for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Elias sat there, stunned. He tried to stand, his hand pushing against the table, but his leg failed him. "Stay seated, Sergeant," Sterling commanded softly. "You've stood enough." Around the room, the other officers in the general's entourage snapped to attention and saluted. Then the MPs. Then slowly, the tables nearby, one by one, the mess hall rose. Chairs scraped. Boots stomped. Within moments, every single person in Mess Hall 404 was standing at attention, saluting the old janitor in the corner. Even Miller. He stood there, tears of shame streaming down his face, his hand raised in a salute that shook with regret. Elias looked around the room. He looked at the sea of uniforms. He looked at the respect in their eyes. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was warm. It was heavy with honor. He looked down at the P-38 in his hand. He rubbed his thumb over the rusted metal one last time, then tucked it back beneath his shirt. He looked at the general, the son of the boy he hadn't left behind. "Your dad was a good Marine," Elias said, his voice breaking. "He was," Sterling nodded, "but he said you were the best." The salute ended not with a shout, but with a slow, collective exhale. General Sterling lowered his hand, and the sound of 200 boots shifting on the linoleum filled the void. The spell was broken, but the air in Mess Hall 404 remained heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on the back of every neck stand up. Lance Corporal Miller stood frozen, his arm falling limp to his side. He looked small now. The arrogance that had inflated his chest just minutes ago had hissed out of him, leaving behind a terrified boy in a uniform he suddenly felt unworthy to wear. "As you were," Sterling murmured, though nobody moved to sit down. The hunger for lunch had been replaced by a hunger for answers. The general turned his gaze back to Miller. The look was not angry. It was disappointed, which was infinitely worse. He picked up his cane from the floor, dusting it off with a slow, deliberate motion. "Lance Corporal," Sterling said, his voice low and dangerous. "You seem to have a lot of energy for enforcing mess hall regulations. You seem very concerned with the cleanliness and order of this facility." "Sir," Miller croaked, his throat dry as sandpaper, "since you are so passionate about the state of this building," Sterling continued, "and since you believe manual labor is beneath the dignity of a warrior, I think it is time for a lesson in humility." Sterling turned to his sergeant major. "Pull his squad assignment. Effective immediately. Lance Corporal Miller is reassigned to facilities maintenance, specifically, the night shift, here, in this mess hall." Miller's eyes widened. "Sir, you will report to Mr. Thorne at 0400 hours every morning for the next 30 days. Sterling ordered, pointing the tip of his cane at Elias. "You will learn how to mop these floors. You will learn how to scrub the grease traps. And you will learn that every job in this corps, from the rifleman to the janitor, relies on respect." The general leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Miller and Elias could hear. "And if I hear that you have shown this man anything less than the reverence due a sainty, I will strip those stripes off your collar so fast the friction will burn your neck. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, General," Miller shouted, tears of shame tracking through the sweat on his face. Sterling turned back to Elias. The hardness in his face melted away. "Elias, my car is outside. There is paperwork to sign, and a debt to be paid." Elias looked at his mop bucket in the corner. He looked at the half-eaten meatloaf on the table. Then he looked at Miller, who was trembling. "He's just a boy, Marcus," Elias said softly, using the general's first name for the first time. "We were all stupid when we were 20. We all thought we were immortal." "He needs to learn," Sterling said. "The Corps has no room for bullies." "He'll learn," Elias said, slowly pushing himself up from the table. He winced as his bad hip took the weight, but this time, Miller instinctively reached out a hand to steady him. Elias paused. He looked at Miller's hand, then up at the young Marine's face. He didn't slap the hand away. He nodded, once. A silent acceptance of the truce. "Let's go, sir," Elias said to the general. "I think my break is over." The ceremony was small. There were no news cameras, no bands playing Sousa marches, no politicians giving speeches about freedom to garner votes. It was held 3 days later in the general's private office, with rain still hammering against the window panes. Elias stood at attention, wearing a suit that Sterling had bought for him, charcoal gray, fitted to hide the stoop in his shoulders. For extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy, the adjutant read from the citation, his voice steady. Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne, United States Marine Corps, Hugh City, February 1968. The words filled the room. They spoke of the church, the jammed machine gun, the run into the kill zone, the refusal to leave a wounded brother. They spoke of valor that went beyond the call of duty. General Sterling stepped forward. In his hands, he held a velvet box. Inside lay the Distinguished Service Cross, acting as the placeholder for the Navy Cross, expedited by the Pentagon due to the clerical error that had listed Elias as KIA. The bronze cross hung from a blue ribbon, heavy with history. Sterling pinned it to Elias's lapel. He didn't rush. He smoothed the ribbon, his hands gentle. "This is 50 years late," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the Corps never forgets." Elias looked down at the medal. It was beautiful, but it wasn't why he had done it. He hadn't run back into the street for a piece of metal. He had done it because Sterling's father had been scared, and you don't let your brother die scared and alone. "Thank you, sir," Elias whispered. "You can retire now, Elias," Sterling said, stepping back. "Full pension, back pay. You never have to lift a mop again. You've done your time. You can rest." Elias looked out the window at the sprawling base. He saw the platoons running in formation in the rain, singing cadence. He saw the young faces, full of fear and fire, preparing for wars they didn't understand yet. "With all due respect, General," Elias said, turning back, "I'd like to keep my job." Sterling smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew the answer before he asked the question. "Why?" "Because these kids," Elias gestured to the window, "they don't know who I am. To them, I'm just the old guy in the background. I'm the ghost. But someone has to watch over them. Someone has to make sure the floor is dry so they don't slip. Someone has to remind them that the war ends, but the Brotherhood doesn't." Elias touched the P-38 beneath his shirt. "Besides," he added, a twinkle in his eye, "I've got a new trainee starting tomorrow at 400, kid named Miller. I think he's got potential, but he needs a lot of work." The next morning, the mess hall was quiet. It was 4:15 hours. The lights were dim. The smell of coffee was just starting to brew. Elias Thorne moved the mop across the floor in long, rhythmic strokes. Swish, swish. It was a meditative sound, a peaceful sound. Behind him, Lance Corporal Miller was scrubbing a table. He was sweating. He wasn't complaining. He was working hard, his movements sharp and focused. "Miller," Elias said, not turning around. "Yes, Mr. Thorne," Miller answered instantly, standing up straight. "You missed a spot. Corner of table 4. "On it," Miller said, moving quickly to fix his mistake. Elias smiled. He stopped mopping for a second and looked at his reflection in the wet floor. He didn't see a janitor. He didn't see a hero. He just saw a Marine doing his job. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the P-38. He tossed it through the air. Miller caught it, surprised. He looked down at the tiny piece of rusted metal in his palm. "Keep it," Elias said, dipping his mop back into the bucket. "Put it on your tags. You never know when things are going to get jammed up." Miller closed his fist around the totem. He looked at Elias with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," Miller whispered. "Don't call me Sergeant," Elias grunted, pushing the mop bucket forward. "Call me Eli. Now get back to work. Breakfast is in 2 hours, and these heroes need to eat." Outside, the rain finally stopped. The sun began to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and fire. The storm was over. The silence remained. But it was no longer empty. It was full of hope. If you are moved by Elias Thorne's story of quiet courage and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Silent Veterans for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.